Hello, and welcome back to Reddit Confessions. She didn't hear me leave. That's the part one keep replaying in my head. Not the weeks of silent dinners, not the perfume that didn't belong to me, not the half smiles she gave her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. Just the fact that I walked out of our front door with a backpack, my shoes in my hand, and she kept breathing slow and even in our bed. The street outside was dark, but not quiet. A delivery truck hissed past. Someone's dog barked behind a fence, and in the distance a train groaned across the bridge. I remember thinking it was the first time in months that I wasn't waiting for her voice to cut the air. My phone was off, on purpose. If she woke up, she'd have nothing. No, where are you? Messages to scroll through later. No missed call she could twist into guilt. Just absence. 3 blocks from the house, I almost turned back. Not because I regretted it, but because I knew exactly what would happen when she realized I was gone. The performance. The frantic calls to my friends, the wide-eyed, "I'm worried about him" speech to anyone who'd listen, the crocodile tears that always made people feel sorry for her instead of me. She's good at that, turning my pain into her sympathy. I almost wanted to stay just to avoid watching her play the concerned wife while hiding the real reason I left. But then I thought of what I'd found 2 nights earlier. Her coat draped over the chair, the pocket heavy with a hotel keycard stamped with dates that didn't match any of her work trips. The smell of cologne on the lining. And tucked into her wallet, a folded receipt for 2 champagne flutes and a sweet upgrade. She'd left it there like she knew I wouldn't dare to look. So I kept walking. Past the diner where we used to sit for hours, past the bus stop where she kissed me in the rain years ago, past the little grocery store where the clerk always called us lovebirds. Those places used to feel like ours. Now they were just scenery in a story I'd stopped being part of. By the time the sun started bleeding into the sky, I was on the other side of the city, standing in front of a cheap apartment I'd paid for in cash under a name I hadn't used in years. No note, no trail, no explanation, just gone. And somewhere back in that house, she was about to open her eyes to an empty bed and a life without me in it. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept through the blinds of that small, rented apartment, I'd been awake for hours, pacing the narrow floor with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator for company. My backpack sat in the corner like a stranger I wasn't ready to unpack, stuffed with only the essentials: laptop, a few clothes, the USB drive holding every important document I could grab without making noise. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't even showered. My mind was still stuck in the moment I closed our front door and stepped into the street, leaving behind the version of myself who had spent years waiting for her to care. I could imagine the exact sequence happening back at the house. She would roll over, reach for her phone, and find the empty space beside her. No note on the nightstand, no text waiting to be read, no gentle explanation she could twist into her own narrative. Just absence. She'd probably think I'd gone for an early walk or to the store. Then she'd notice my keys were gone. Then the backpack. Then the ring. And that's when the first wave of panic would hit her. Not because she missed me, but because she'd lost control. I thought of the way she'd perfected that panic for others. The trembling voice when she told her sister once that she didn't know what was wrong with me, that I'd been distant lately. The way she could cry on cue for her friends, making me the cold, quiet one who never opened up. She was a master at turning herself into the victim, and I was always the silent proof she needed. But not this time. This time, I was gone before she could set the stage. The keycard in her coat pocket had been my breaking point. A hotel far from her office. 2 champagne flutes. A sweet upgrade. She hadn't even bothered to hide it deep in her bag, just left it there, almost daring me to see it. And I had. I'd stood in the hallway that night, holding it between my fingers, listening to her laugh in the other room at something on her phone. My stomach had knotted in a way that felt permanent. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask. I just knew. Now, in that apartment, the reality began to sink in. She would be looking for me soon. Not because she was worried I was hurt, but because she needed to get ahead of the story. She'd call my friends first, those who didn't know the whole truth, and plant her version. Then she'd try my parents, acting broken and betrayed. She might even call the police if it made her look concerned enough. But none of that mattered now. My phone was off, my accounts locked, my trail cold. Still, I couldn't shake the thought. What would she do when she realized she couldn't find me at all? By noon, the air in my little apartment felt heavy, like it was holding its breath with me. I sat at the small table by the window, sipping lukewarm coffee, staring at a world that didn't yet know I'd disappeared. It was strange. No one was pounding on my door, no urgent knocks, no frantic messages, but I could feel her realization growing like a storm far away. Somewhere across the city, Callie had woken up to an empty bed, and her morning had gone from confusion to alarm. I knew her patterns too well. First, she would have checked the kitchen, expecting to find me making breakfast. Then she'd search the living room, the bathroom, the porch. She'd call my phone, and it would go straight to voicemail. She'd try again, maybe 6 or 7 times, until that tight, angry disbelief set in. The kind she'd used to convince herself this was my fault. That was when the panic would start to sound real, even if it was only for her audience. I pictured her next move with painful clarity. She'd call my best friend, Owen, who has always been too polite to tell her what he really thinks. She'd put on that soft, breaking voice, the one she used when she needed sympathy, saying she just didn't know what Lowell's going through lately, leaving out every reason I'd ever had to leave. Then she'd call her sister and sprinkle in just enough concern to make herself look like the one abandoned. She'd hint at my mood swings, at my distance, at my habit of shutting down. And they'd believe her, because for years, I let her own the narrative. I glanced at the backpack in the corner, still unopened. Inside was everything I needed to stay gone. Cash, documents, a burner phone I hadn't turned on yet. I kept telling myself that I'd made the right choice, but I couldn't stop my mind from looping back to that hotel keycard. The cheap plastic rectangle had been sitting in her coat pocket like a confession she didn't bother to hide. I'd held it in my hand that night, staring at the embossed logo, imagining the room, the laughter, the clink of champagne glasses. She must have known I'd find it eventually. Maybe that was the point. Maybe she wanted me to see it so she could blame me for snooping instead of admitting what it meant. Now, in this apartment with the blinds half closed, I thought about turning on the burner phone. I could see the headlines of my own life in my head. Husband leaves without a word. I wondered if she'd be furious or thrilled that I'd made it so clean. No messy confrontation, no shouting match to make her feel justified, just a silent exit. I also wondered if she'd already started tracking me in ways I hadn't considered. She's resourceful when she wants to be, and I'd seen her dig up people's private details for work more times than I could count. If she decided she wanted to find me, she might just manage it. That thought sat in my chest like a stone. Because the truth was, I didn't want her to find me. Not now. Not after all the months of being treated like I was something she'd outgrown. I wanted her to feel the absence, not as an opportunity to play the victim, but as a void she couldn't spin her way out of. I told myself I'd stay here for a while, let her burn through her calls and her stories until the panic turned into something real. But deep down, I knew Callie, and I knew the real search hadn't even started yet. By the second day, the walls of the apartment seemed to lean in on me, carrying the weight of everything I'd done and everything I hadn't. I hadn't slept much. Every sound outside kept me on edge, as if any second I'd hear her voice calling my name from the street. The burner phone sat on the table, still off, and I kept circling it like it was some kind of live explosive. I imagined the moment I finally powered it on, the avalanche of missed calls, the desperate voicemails crafted to sound broken but calculated enough to win sympathy. She wouldn't be screaming or accusing yet. That came later. For now, she'd be in the please come home phase, wrapping concern around her words like a silk ribbon around a knife. I pictured her morning, and I could practically see it. Callie at the kitchen table, hair tied back, hands wrapped around her coffee mug like she's the one who's been wronged. The first day after I vanished, she'd still been in performance mode, making the right calls, playing the right part. But today, the edges of her control would start to fray. Because when people like her lose control, it doesn't just unsettle them, it terrifies them. She'd be wondering who I'd talked to before leaving, who knew the truth, and whether any of her carefully spun stories were starting to unravel. I kept replaying the moment that broke me. The hotel keycard, still warm from her coat pocket, and the receipt folded neatly beside it. No confrontation, no accusations, just a silent exchange between my shaking hands and the cold, lifeless plastic. I didn't need to ask questions. The answers were already there in the dates, the times, the expensive champagne. And the cruelest part? I could still hear her laugh from the other room that night, like nothing in the world could touch her. That was when I realized I didn't matter in her story anymore. I was just background noise she'd learned to tune out. But now, here I was, in a place she didn't know existed, and for the first time in years, I held something she couldn't control, my absence. I had no idea how far she'd go to find me. She was clever, connected, and perfectly capable of turning friends into spies without them realizing it. It was only a matter of time before she figured out which loose threads to pull. And the dangerous part? I wasn't entirely sure what she'd do when she found me, whether she'd try to pull me back into her world or tear me apart for leaving it. I sat at the table, staring at the unopened backpack in the corner. It was more than just my belongings. It was my exit plan, my lifeline. The longer I stayed here, the higher the chances she'd catch my trail. I told myself I'd keep moving soon, vanish again before she got close. But some part of me, maybe the weak, needy part, wanted to see what she'd do first, how far she'd go when she realized I was truly gone. And in that moment, I knew one thing. The real game hadn't even started yet. By the third day, I realized disappearing wasn't the hardest part, staying gone was. The first 48 hours had been a mix of adrenaline and silence, but now the silence was turning into something sharper, something that cut if I sat still for too long. The apartment was too small to pace, yet I found myself circling it anyway, restless, like an animal in a cage it had chosen. I'd stopped opening the blinds completely. Every time sunlight pushed its way in, it felt like an invitation for someone to see me, and the thought of her spotting me, by chance or by design, made my chest tighten. I hadn't left the building since arriving. My food came from a late-night delivery guy who didn't ask questions, and my water came straight from the tap. My only company was the sound of the radiator clanking like it was struggling to breathe. I still hadn't turned on the burner phone, but I could imagine exactly what was waiting for me inside it. Callie's voice, carefully fractured, begging me to call her back. A string of messages that would start soft, "I'm worried about you," then edge toward sharp, "You're overreacting, we can talk about this," before inevitably hitting cold. "If you think this is going to hurt me, you're wrong." She knew how to push every button I had, and I'd given her the manual over 9 years of marriage. She wouldn't waste it. The funny thing was, in the quiet of that apartment, I could still hear her, as if she were sitting right across from me. I could hear the way she'd laugh when she thought she had the upper hand, that subtle lift in her voice when she was lying but confident she wouldn't get caught. I'd lived with those sounds for years, long before the hotel keycard ever landed in my palm. That keycard wasn't a surprise, it was confirmation. The dates matched a weekend she told me she was buried in work and couldn't possibly make it home. The champagne receipt was just the signature on a letter I'd been reading for months. I found myself wondering what story she was telling now. She'd never admit the truth, not even to herself. No, she'd be telling people I'd had emotional problems for a while, that I was unpredictable, that my leaving was sudden and unprovoked. She'd sprinkle in just enough truth to make the lies believable, mention the occasional argument, my long hours at home, my reluctance to go to her work events. The people who already liked her would eat it up. The ones who liked me would hesitate, wondering if maybe she was right. And she'd thrive in that uncertainty, because it meant the truth was slipping further from reach. Still, part of me knew she wouldn't settle for just controlling the story. She'd want to find me, not to bring me back out of love or even guilt, but to prove she still could. And that was the part that kept me up at night. The knowledge that Callie was the kind of person who didn't lose things without a fight, and when she fought, she made sure to leave scars. I told myself that if I was smart, I'd move again before she got too close. But as much as I hated to admit it, some part of me wanted to see just how far she'd go. I wanted to know what she'd risk, who she'd use, how desperate she'd get when the control she lived for was out of her reach. And maybe, deep down, I wanted to know if she'd ever admit, just once, that losing me mattered at all. By the fourth day, the tension had settled in my body like it had moved in and planned to stay. Every sound outside the apartment felt like it might be connected to her. The sharp slam of a car door, the echo of footsteps in the hallway, even the creak of the building's old pipes. I'd caught myself holding my breath more than once, frozen in the middle of the room like a man who thought standing still might make him invisible. I hadn't left the apartment since arriving, and the air was starting to taste stale, like secrets left too long in a closed box. but the fear of being seen outweighed the discomfort of staying hidden. The burner phone still sat in the same spot on the table, its blank screen almost taunting me. I knew it was foolish to turn it on, yet my mind wouldn't stop imagining what might be waiting inside. By now, Callie would have shifted into a new phase. The first 2 days, she would have played the concerned spouse, her voice trembling just enough to convince people she was heartbroken. By the third day, that act would have started to slip, replaced by the kind of clipped, pointed messages designed to draw me out. But the fourth day, that's when she would start digging in earnest. I knew her patterns, her ability to use charm, pity, and pressure in perfect rotation until she got what she wanted. If she was already calling my family, my friends, and maybe even showing up at places I used to go, it meant the search was no longer about finding me. It was about proving she could. I imagined the way she'd do it, and it made my stomach turn. She'd go to Owen first, because he's too polite to turn her away. She'd pretend she was barely holding herself together, eyes wide, voice soft, framing me as the one who abandoned her without warning. She'd ask if he'd heard from me, not because she expected an answer, but to plant the idea that my silence was a sign of instability. Then she'd visit my parents, masking her calculated curiosity with fake warmth, probably showing up with some store-bought pie so she could sit at their table and coax information out of them without ever looking like she was interrogating. And the worst part? She'd be good at it. People wanted to believe Callie was the kind of woman who cared deeply because she'd mastered the art of looking like she did. I couldn't stop thinking about the hotel keycard, the one I'd found in her coat pocket just days before I left. It wasn't the object itself that haunted me. It was the realization that she hadn't even bothered to hide it well. It felt like a quiet message. I know you'll find this, and I know you won't do anything about it. And for months, she'd been right. But the night I finally saw it for what it was, everything inside me shifted. That piece of plastic was the proof I'd been pretending I didn't need. I'd seen the dates, the champagne receipt tucked beside it, the room upgrade. I didn't have to imagine the rest. I could picture it all with sickening clarity. Now, sitting in that dim apartment, I wondered if she understood yet that I wasn't coming back. That this wasn't some petty move in an argument. I'd taken myself out of her story entirely, and people like Callie don't forgive that. If anything, it makes them dangerous. She'd either find me to prove she still could, or destroy whatever I'd managed to build for myself in the meantime. And as much as I told myself I was ready to vanish again if she got close, part of me wanted to see just how far she was willing to go to pull me back into her world. The truth was, I wasn't sure who would break first, her, from not knowing where I was, or me, from wondering if she even cared that I'd gone. By the fifth day, the paranoia had stopped feeling like paranoia and started feeling like inevitability. I woke up before dawn, not because I couldn't sleep, but because my body had learned to anticipate the smallest disturbances, like it was bracing for an intrusion that hadn't happened yet. The apartment was dark, silent, but there was an undeniable tension in the air, the kind that makes you feel watched even when you know you're alone. I didn't bother turning on the lights. I just sat at the kitchen table in the shadows, staring at the burner phone, still refusing to touch it, even though it had become the gravitational center of the room. I thought about Callie and what her days must look like now. I could see her in my mind, pacing our living room with her phone pressed to her ear, trying to keep her voice calm while she sifted through every possible lead. She'd already have called Owen, my parents, maybe even a couple of my old coworkers who barely knew me anymore. She wouldn't admit she was desperate yet. People like Callie never admit that, but her tone would have changed. That warm, "I'm just concerned," act would be wearing thin, replaced with something sharper, colder, edged with the kind of control she was losing. The more she lost it, the more relentless she would become. And she'd have help. I had no illusions about that. Callie had always been good at enlisting people without them realizing they were part of her game. Friends who thought they were just checking in on me would unknowingly be feeding her information. Family members who thought they were offering comfort would be confirming details about my habits, my patterns, the places I might go if I wanted to disappear. Every piece of intel would go straight into the puzzle she was building. And the worst part was, she'd be smart enough not to follow me directly at first. She'd circle, cut off exits, and wait for me to step somewhere she could see. The memory of that hotel keycard still gnawed at me, though not for the obvious reasons. Yes, it was proof she'd been somewhere she shouldn't, with someone she wouldn't name, but more than that, it was the sheer indifference of it. Leaving it in her coat pocket was almost taunting, like she believed I'd see it and still choose to swallow it down, like I had so many other times. For months, she'd treated my silence as a guarantee, not a choice. The moment I walked out that door, I shattered that expectation, and I knew that alone was enough to make her furious. Sitting in the dim kitchen, I weighed my next move. The smart thing would be to leave this apartment before she got too close. I'd chosen it for its anonymity, but anonymity never lasts when someone is willing to dig hard enough. Yet a stubborn part of me wanted to stay just a little longer, to see how far she would go. I wanted to watch her spin, to know if she'd show her real face once there was no one left to convince. But that desire came with a risk. The longer I stayed, the more I was gambling with my own freedom. It was a dangerous game, and I was starting to suspect that neither of us was willing to lose gracefully. By the sixth day, I knew it was time to end it. Not just the hiding, but the entire chapter of my life where I'd been nothing more than a background character in my own story. That morning, instead of pacing the apartment or sitting in the dark with my thoughts, I opened the blinds and let the light pour in. It was almost blinding after so many days in shadow, but it felt like breathing fresh air for the first time in years. I made coffee, not because I needed it to wake up, but because it was my choice to do so, simple, but mine. I didn't turn on the burner phone. I didn't need to. Whatever calls, voicemails, or messages waited there were relics of a life I wasn't going back to. Instead, I packed my bag, this time without the tightness in my chest. The hotel keycard, the champagne receipt, the half-truths and performance. It all felt distant now, like something I'd read in a book and quietly closed. For once, I wasn't leaving out of fear. I was leaving because I wanted to see what I could build when no one was standing over my shoulder rewriting my story. I took a bus out of the city, no plan, no destination marked on a map, just the steady hum of the road beneath me. Somewhere along the way, I caught myself smiling, not because everything was fixed, but because I finally had space to imagine a future without her shadow over it. A future where my absence from her life wasn't the story anymore, because I'd be too busy living my own. I don't know if Callie ever found out where I went, and honestly, I don't care. That part of my life is closed. What matters now is that I didn't just disappear from her world. I reappeared in my own. And that's where my story ends for now. But I want to hear from you. What moment in this story stood out the most to you? Which part made you stop and think? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these kinds of confessions, make sure you stay tuned here on Reddit Confessions for more stories that will keep you hooked from start to finish.